after retirement, all of a sudden, they realized that something had changed in Chuck. And Chuck, all of a sudden, during that time of transition, started experiencing outbursts of anger. Sometimes would be getting lost, going traveling. And he was confused at times, and sometimes he would be start tripping and really couldn't hold himself together. And eventually, Chuck was diagnosed with what they call amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. And worse yet, it was compounded frontotemporal dementia. So as his brain continued to deteriorate very rapidly, as you know, the Lou Gehrig disease is a unique kind of a rare kind of neurological disorder that affects your muscle. So his muscle actually started to weaken and body started to waste away, ultimately left him paralyzed. Now the story goes as such that Mickey started turning herself into a caregiver role. What she did was she used to work 40 hours a week, and then she scaled back to 15 hours because her husband's condition, also hire a home health provider to care for them. As every morning, Mickey does this. She has a routine. She would start helping Chuck first toileting, grooming, and dressing him up, and teach him how to use the feeding tube, and then help him to take him to multiple doctor's appointments every week, along with a professional caregiver at the home. She took over the home finances, which used to be done by Chuck, household maintenance, all the cleaning, and then all of a sudden she realized that toward some part into her journey of caregiving, she started grappling with grief, lots of anxiety, frustration that this is a journey that she had never anticipated. And she felt like not only her husband was slipping away, she felt like she slipped away too, the term called loss of self. So she said this is by Mickey, said, "I thought the hardest thing I ever done was working and getting my PhD. While being a single parent, after my first marriage ended. But little did I know that caregiving, advocating for my husband, while maintaining only a barely 15-hour practice, was the most difficult time of her life." And 16 months after diagnosis, Chuck passed away at the age of 66. So the reason I'm sharing this is I don't know how many people out there actually resonate with this story. I don't know if anybody would be willing to just, put in a chat box, hey, I've been through something like this. Having said that, we're going to advance the next the next slide. So the reality with American society is such that in 2016, about 7 years ago, 16 million Americans are caring for their older parents or spouse somehow. The anticipation is that in approximately 27 years from now, the number will nearly double. And 30 million people actually will be caregiver for their family member in certain illnesses or whatnot. And that is not even counting the mentally ill. So having this picture in mind, and we want to advance to the next slide, it tells us this following story, is that throughout our lifetime, many people in our family would develop some kind of physical, mental disability over their lifetime. Now, the interesting thing is that family member usually is the first line of defense. Now, that probably sounds obvious or just sound, as a given, right? But at the same time, as family member somehow become caregiver, they endure tremendous personal sacrifices. And the sacrifice is actually presented in a multidimensional manner, meaning that it's not just impacting one way. It impacts them financially, physically, mentally, emotionally, and in many different ways. So why don't go to the next slide, please? So in the next slide, okay, now we want to examine a little bit of effects of caregiving. The bottom line is that we want to recognize caregiving is always stressful. I have never ever heard of family members that, caregiving for my elderly parent or caring for my ill son has not been as stressful in some way. It all been a stressful experience. The second thing is that the demand that takes toll on the family is unprecedented. meaning that there's likely very few events in lifetime that would take the amount of stress, ongoing, endearing and enduring as caregiving does. So naturally, when we talk about family being the first line of defense, right? It turns out that many family member become the caregiver, but sometimes that caregiving circle expands, and including friends and people outside the family, they all become part of that caregiving picture. So in the 2016, there was a study done on the effects of caregiving, is that usually it's not the patient themselves that were suffering, but the family member themselves. They themselves are vulnerable to a very high level of stress and strain. What that does is that it negatively impacts family dynamic. So some people actually, in well-meaning manner, venture into caregiving because they felt like that's the thing to do, and they felt that responsibility should not and cannot go to anyone else. So family said, you know what, I don't want to let the caregiving go to anyone else. I'm going to be doing the caregiving. Little did they know that they actually set themselves to negatively impact relationships, changing the dynamic of family in multidimensional way. So I want to take a picture of the next slide, which was a study done by National Alliance for Caregiving, and as well two mental health organizations that cater to the mentally ill adult. This is what they find. More than 70% of people, we believe that this number, 70%, may have been undercounted. And about 3/4 of people feel like this process is, putting a tremendous emotional stress on them, let alone the physical part. 50% of them find that they couldn't even find the right medication dosages for their loved one and trying to figure out how to caregive properly. And about a little less than half of them find that they themselves having trouble caring for their own health. So about 1/3 of the people feel like, only 1/3 of the people, really sadly, right? 33% of mentally ill people who are getting care, and they felt like most of the medication actually do not work. On top of that, and even if they work, they have a hard time getting the loved one to adhere to medication regimen. Now, this is a term what we call caregiving outcome in a what we call positive or negative adaptation, because when situations is stressful, you learn to adapt. Now you can adapt in a positive way or a negative way. Unfortunately, most of the caregivers tend to take on a negative adaptation by feeling alone, feeling very bitter about the situation because somehow that caring responsibility was supposed to be a family project, and it turns out to be a loner. And a lot of time you'll be stuck there feeling like you don't have a life. And the term, therefore, called loss of self is often described by caregiver. If they get to the point that stress start to be insurmountable, they become burnout, and they themselves become mentally ill themselves. And in most of the cases for caregiving, we find that if you are going to do that alone as a lone caregiver, you have a poor health outcome. You also have suffer from mental health yourself. So what does that all mean to us, right? Now, to learn a lesson from the research that we have seen, and as well as the experience shared by other caregiver, the important thing to do is that I always advise every family, whether their patient is mentally ill or physically ill, is that caregiving should never be a solo effort. Now, I cannot, emphasize enough. I don't know how many family members here may have Alzheimer or dementia in some way, or diabetes. I would assume there are a number of them out there. Every person that cares in a solo manner always burn out. So if you forget everything that we talked about tonight, please remember that do not venture into caregiving in a solo manner. And the second thing is that we always encourage the caregiver themselves, try to establish a sense of norm outside of caregiving by, having someone else to help out. So they themselves can actually start seeking social support. The social support can come in many ways. For example, from church Bible study, from Bible study fellowship, or even, having a weekly hiking group with the family who are caregiver, they all take a little caregiving vacation and go hiking or somehow, and then leave the caring to someone else. That is tremendously helpful in buffering the stress. Now, another thing is that if you are the sole caregiver, it means that there's no continuity of care because you do sleep somehow, and you do have your medical appointment, you do have your own event to go to. So what it means is that if you want to have continuity of care, you better think about having a team approach. So having said that, we want to encourage people thinking about the following unthinkable way, or sometimes this is, I know a lot of our attendees tonight, some of which are Asian Americans. Now, Asian Americans seem to have a very high sense of loyalty to their family member. Not that the mainstream American family do not, but Asian American especially have this high sense of loyalty and duty, wanting to care for their family member. They would wanted to always keep their family at home as much as possible. And we have this term too that that's a fitting call. We want to find the least restrictive setting for someone that needs care would usually be the best approach. However, there are certain cases where I find that that is not feasible, where you may need to think about professional placement, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. Now, so can we advance to the next slide? Then we want to ask a question. When will you reach a point you feel like perhaps at-home caregiving is still feasible or not feasible? So I want to offer some thoughts here. And these are, again, from research too. If the person who's under care is physically and mentally stable, meaning that if they have the medication, you take them out, you interact with a limited number of people, they do their chore, they could get by everyday life. And that's considered stable, and they can adhere to the medication regimen. And medication dispensing is another trick that we often have to deal with family who have folks who have dementia. And if the caregiving team largely composed of people with good physical and mental health. Now, if you have those two equations lined up and you're no longer caring in a solo fashion, you can very much consider stay-at-home care. Now, the following condition will kind of lead you to thinking about professional placement. And can we advance to the next slide? When you notice that the patient under care is starting to deteriorate mentally, physically somehow. So, for example, I used to care for this patient, this gentleman who had dementia, and he's in wonderful physical condition, but his brain is starting to lose focus and start to not recognize and getting lost all the time. So the first thing he gets up is that he want to run for the door and open the door and go out and take a walk. Unfortunately, 9 out of 10 times he doesn't know how to make his way back. So that is something where we consider you need to really fortify your home or safekeeping your home so that the person under care will not be able to run out on its own on a door that's already in like reverse lock and somehow. Now, if that safety and the condition is deteriorating to a point that you feel like the caregiving is no longer effective at home, this is where you really need to consider that let's start to do something about it. The thing that I often encourage is that people who give care should regularly engage in self-care. That engage in self-care usually include the following three elements called the SAMs, right? Called S, A, and M. Now, the SAMs include three elements that we usually do every day. If you forget almost everything that you're going to hear tonight, and at least I hope that you remember the SAMs for a caregiver. S is for your own sleep. I don't know how many caregivers ended up getting up late at night, always get their sleep interrupted, and they themselves do not rest well. They wake up in a foggy mind and also in an irritable mood. So if you can achieve at least 75 to 80% quality of sleep as a caregiver, then you're in a good place. Now, can anybody guess what A might be? So I talk about sleep, right, as one of the caregiving criteria. Can anybody guess what A might be? Anybody want to take a guess? Take a shot at it? Okay, well, we don't have a... I'm sorry, can you say a little louder?
We're on mute. We have to unmute ourselves to do it, but I was going to say appetite. I don't know.
Okay, well, Appetite is next. Okay, you're one step ahead of us. So let me just clue you in. A stands for activities. So activity have two kinds, right? If you're a caregiver, I know that there's no shortage of physical activity, but you want to do some physical activity that's pleasant. For example, the cited example, going hiking or riding bike, go scuba diving, do whatever, physically active, and then something that is like in terms of feeding your own soul, right? So activity will be physical and pleasant. Okay, so we talk about S, we talk about A. Now, Pastor Kurt's already talked about the M, right? The M is stand for meals or your appetite. I want to encourage a caregiver too that now, if the person under care doesn't eat regularly, you have to be the one that eating regularly, and you want to be regularly nourishing your body. I often, encourage people, if you are one of those that eat 3 meals regularly, try to stick to about the same time and about the same portion. If you're only eating 2 meals, try not to skip breakfast, and then because the duration between dinner and the breakfast is almost like 12 hours. If you skip breakfast, that will be in 16 hours or whatnot. So the SAM are the major criteria for caregiver to be, faithfully be disciplined about in terms of, building up your own ability to care for other people. Now, when you notice that your caregiving is no longer tenable, where the person under care often get lost, run away, burn stove, or create messes at home, this is where you really need to seriously think about caregiving in a professional setting. Now, this approach may not be as daunting as you may think, because we do have a lot of social workers, and for example, I would encourage people to talk to the primary doctor first. Hey, my mom or my dad is really exceed our capacity to be staying at home. What do we do? Now, the professional usually would engage with a team of, professional nurses and social worker, and to come up with a formula. Say, hey, you know what? Under this situation, I would recommend that your parent may need to be at certain facility, and vice versa, where they actually get more daily interaction with people. Maybe they need to be placed in a senior center where, as you know, in the state of America, is that caregiving for senior folk come in many tiers based on the level of care. If you're independent living, you can do most of the cooking yourself. Those are the independent least amount of care facility. To assisted living, the convalescent home, and the level of care rises. Now, we haven't really spoken about caregiving for what happened, caring for your own children. Now, this is something that we have seen on the rise. For example, autism has been on the rise. As we know, today the rate of autism is about 1 in 36 kids. Unfortunately, a lot of these folks with autism, they will grow up, become adult, but they tend to be what they call, sometimes they don't outlive the parent, they die earlier than their parent. Some outlive the parent. Under those circumstances, you really do need to think about how to take care of them when you're gone. And this is a daunting possibility that is faced a lot of families. Some families just feel, oh my God, I feel so desperate and feel so guilty because I'm not going to be there to take care of my children. So, tonight I just want to bring some thoughts and bring some discussion with all of you, thinking about what caregiving looks like for physically and mentally ill. And I just present you with this very last diagram. I often call it zero line of mental health, meaning that if you stay above the zero line, that is where your caregiver all should be. Now, if somewhere along that line, that caregiving process have taken you below that zero crossing line, and this is where you need to withdraw and be concerned about how to elicit help and engage in caregiving. So that's all the PowerPoint I was going to present tonight. I promise, Pastor Curtis and also Carol, that I only limit my part of speaking to half an hour, and we can entertain discussions or, feedbacks or even, questions and whatnot. So